A billionaire hires a humble maid to care for his dying father, and days later, he discovers a devastating secret that will change his life forever. That's exactly what you'll witness in today's story, how an unexpected bond between two people from opposite worlds unearths dark truths and forces a powerful man to confront everything he thought he knew. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love powerful emotional stories like this, make sure to like the video. Enjoy the story. The Lancaster Holdings empire had been a pillar of American industry for nearly a century, its power woven deep into the steel and energy sectors along the East Coast. Yet now, its formidable patriarch, William Lancaster, lay dying in the shadows of a once grand Boston mansion. The estate, echoing with past triumphs, had become a place of somber ritual, where high-priced nurses and specialists came and went, without effect. When traditional care failed, the housekeeper suggested an unconventional choice: a local caregiver known not for medical expertise, but for offering something few in the Lancaster world understood anymore: compassion. Enter Lucia Morales, a young woman from the struggling town of Lowell. Her family's fortune had long since vanished, her mother's health declining, and their small apartment barely keeping out the New England cold. The offer to work at the Lancaster estate came unexpectedly, but it was impossible to refuse. Dressed in her only professional uniform, frayed at the seams, Lucia arrived at the mansion with quiet determination. From the towering portraits in the Great Hall to the cold stares of the staff, everything around her screamed she did not belong. Her first true test came that very evening. A private dinner for Lancaster board members and close family was underway. Ethan Lancaster, William's son and current CEO, presided over the table, flanked by his glamorous fiancée, Victoria Hale, a woman who saw the world strictly through the lens of wealth and status. As Lucia discreetly moved through the hallway, Victoria spotted her and seized the opportunity for a public jab. "Really, Ethan, this is the maid you hired to tend to your father. She looks like she should be cleaning a diner, not this house." The comment hung in the air. Lucia, head bowed but unshaken, continued without response, leaving behind a stunned silence. Ethan witnessed it all without a flicker of emotion. His years at the helm of a ruthless corporate empire had taught him the value of detachment. In his mind, Lucia was another temporary fixture in the endless machinery of Lancaster Holdings. A tool, nothing more. He saw no reason to intervene or waste thought on the matter. His father's condition and the company's escalating challenges occupied his mind fully, but fate had its own designs. The following morning, restless and sleepless, Ethan wandered the mansion's east wing. There, from the half-open door of his father's room, he heard an unfamiliar voice, soft, steady, and unmistakably human. Peering inside, he found Lucia reading aloud, her voice filling the room with warmth that no machine or nurse had provided. To Ethan's astonishment, his father's hand twitched ever so slightly, a movement unseen in weeks of treatment. He said nothing then, retreating silently. Yet an unexpected curiosity took hold. Later that afternoon, he found himself drawn once more to the east wing. This time, Lucia was gently wiping William's brow, her voice low and comforting as she spoke to him. Again, faint reactions followed. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he could not quantify. an unsettling crack in his carefully constructed worldview. As days passed, his observations continued. Ethan began to orchestrate his schedule to witness Lucia's visits. Though he remained unseen, Victoria noticed his growing distraction. During preparations for a gala, she remarked sharply, "You seem unusually preoccupied with the East Wing. Don't tell me the maid has captured your attention." Ethan dismissed her with practiced indifference, though inwardly her words struck a nerve. The boundaries between his world and Lucia's were blurring in ways he could not easily dismiss. Determined to understand this enigma, Ethan ordered a discreet background investigation. The report arrived swiftly, and its revelations rattled him to the core. Lucia Morales was no ordinary caregiver. Her father, Miguel Morales, had once owned a modest manufacturing firm in Lowell until a hostile takeover orchestrated by none other than Lancaster Holdings destroyed it. Behind that ruthless move had been William Lancaster himself. The collapse had driven Miguel to an early death and plunged his family into poverty. Reading the report, Ethan's world tilted. Here was a woman with every reason to hate his family, yet who cared for his father with unfeigned kindness. The contradiction gnawed at him. Was she plotting revenge, using proximity to gather evidence? Or did her compassion stem from something deeper, something he had long forgotten existed in his own world? His first instinct was to distance her, to avoid risk. But each time he watched her at his father's side, another piece of his armor fell away. There was no trace of calculation in her demeanor. When they spoke briefly, her responses were calm, honest, and free of manipulation. Slowly, reluctantly, Ethan began to question whether the true threat in his life was not Lucia, but the legacy of deceit and arrogance that had built his empire. Victoria's resentment boiled over. One afternoon, finding Lucia alone in the library, she unleashed a venomous tirade. "You think playing the angel will win you sympathy here? You're nothing, and you'll leave with nothing." Lucia met her gaze evenly. "I have nothing to prove. To you." Unseen, Ethan heard every word. For the first time, he saw Victoria not as an ally, but as a reflection of the very corruption he had ignored for too long. Now the questions Ethan faced were no longer about Lucia's intentions, but about his own. Could he confront the truth of his father's sins and his own? Could he dismantle the false world he had helped uphold? The answers remained elusive, but one thing had become clear. This woman, this supposed outsider, had already begun to change everything. Ethan Lancaster's life had been governed by a simple, ruthless equation. Control equaled power. Yet for the first time, something he could not control was unfolding right under his roof. Lucia Morales, daughter of a man whose life had been destroyed by Lancaster Holdings, was now the only presence eliciting even the faintest sign of life from his comatose father. The more Ethan observed, the more he questioned how this woman, who by all logic should despise the Lancasters, showed only grace and compassion. The contradiction gnawed at him, and soon curiosity gave way to an unsettling fascination. He found himself orchestrating opportunities to encounter Lucia beyond the walls of his father's room, probing for cracks in her demeanor. But each time, she remained the same, calm, respectful, never once suggesting she knew of the past between their families. Meanwhile, tensions within the mansion simmered. Victoria Hale, already possessive of her place in Ethan's life and empire, sensed a shift she couldn't name. Her comments grew sharper, her disdain toward Lucia more overt. At a board luncheon held in the house, she remarked within earshot of several key investors, "It's astonishing how quickly the staff forget their place around here." Though the jab was veiled, her glare made its target obvious. Ethan, for the first time in years, publicly contradicted her. "Perhaps we should worry less about appearances and more about results," he said, voice cool, eyes locked on hers. The silence that followed was deafening. Privately, Victoria confronted him. "You're letting this woman get inside your head. She's manipulating you, Ethan. People like her always have an angle." But Ethan no longer trusted Victoria's instincts, nor his own entirely. To regain clarity, he needed answers, and not from a surveillance report. One evening, under the pretense of casual conversation, he invited Lucia to share tea in the solarium. It was a calculated move. He asked her about her upbringing, her mother's health, her choice to become a caregiver. Lucia spoke plainly, never once mentioning her father or what had been taken from her family. Yet every word chipped away at Ethan's defenses. This was no opportunist. If she knew the history, she was either the finest actress he'd ever met, or a woman of uncommon integrity. The next morning, driven by unease, Ethan visited his father's old study, a room untouched since William's collapse. He searched through decades of records, hoping to confirm or refute what he had learned about the Morales acquisition. Buried among files of mergers and hostile takeovers, he found them. Documents signed by his father, letters from Miguel Morales pleading for reconsideration, even personal notes from William expressing regret. Ethan stared at the pages, heart heavy. His father had known the destruction he wrought, and had tried too late to reverse it. Before Ethan could process this discovery, a new threat surfaced. Gerald King, Lancaster Holdings' most powerful board member and architect of many ruthless deals, caught wind of Ethan's inquiries and Lucia's growing presence. King understood the risk. If Lucia's connection to the Morales scandal became public, it could trigger legal battles and media fallout that would cripple the company. Without consulting Ethan, King set wheels in motion. Through a shadow network of private contractors, he arranged intimidation against Lucia's mother, hoping to scare the family into silence. The first sign of danger came subtly. Lucia arrived one morning with a pale face and trembling hands. Her usual calm had fractured. Concerned, Ethan pressed her privately. After some resistance, she revealed everything. Two men had approached her mother outside their apartment, issuing veiled threats about keeping her daughter's mouth shut. Ethan's reaction was swift and cold. He summoned his head of security and ordered immediate protection for Lucia and her mother. More importantly, he realized the threat came from inside his own house. Rage simmered beneath Ethan's composure. That evening he confronted Gerald King in a private meeting. "If I find your fingerprints on this," he warned, "I'll burn down everything you've built." King, unflappable, replied, "You're losing your edge, Ethan. Sentimentality has no place in this business. If you won't protect the company, others will." The gauntlet had been thrown. Ethan now faced a choice: preserve the empire at all costs, or confront the corruption that had sustained it. Determined to act, Ethan began gathering evidence, documents, recordings, anything that could expose King's illicit dealings. Simultaneously, he moved to shield Lucia. Against her protests, he insisted she remain under protection while continuing her care for William. Their interactions grew deeper, marked by an unspoken bond forged through shared peril. Though Ethan never apologized for the sins of his family, his actions spoke volumes. Lucia, too, remained poised. When Ethan asked why she stayed, her answer was simple: "Because your father deserves dignity, and because I choose not to live in hatred." The weight of those words lingered with Ethan. Days turned into restless nights as he orchestrated his counterstrike against King. Meanwhile, the board's undercurrents grew dangerous. King, sensing Ethan's resolve, began rallying allies for a coup, an emergency vote to remove Ethan as CEO under the pretense of emotional instability and poor judgment. Word reached Ethan through a trusted ally. Time was running out. Ethan doubled down. With the help of his legal team and a few loyal board members, he prepared to expose King's network of shell companies, bribery trails, and unlawful intimidation tactics. The final confrontation loomed. On the eve of the scheduled board vote, Ethan met with Lucia in his father's room. William, though still comatose, seemed strangely at peace under her care. Ethan looked at her then, not as an employee, not as a symbol of guilt, but as the one person in his world whose strength had remained uncorrupted. As the clock ticked toward the boardroom showdown, Ethan made a silent vow. Whatever the cost, the rot within Lancaster Holdings would be excised, and should the empire fall in the process, so be it. Some legacies were not worth saving. What mattered now was not the company, but what kind of man he would be when the dust settled. The morning of the board vote arrived with an air of quiet dread, hanging over the Lancaster Holdings headquarters. Ethan Lancaster had not slept. He had spent the previous night with his legal team and trusted advisors, piecing together the final assault against Gerald King. In his hands, he now held the evidence that could end King's reign of corruption once and for all. Documents linking King to fraudulent shell companies, illegal acquisitions, and the intimidation of innocent families like the Moraleses. Yet the outcome was far from certain. King controlled enough board members to force Ethan out unless the proof hit like a hammer. Ethan knew this was no longer about business. It was about legacy, about stripping away the rot his father had once allowed to fester. And it was about protecting Lucia, whose life had already been endangered once. Lucia herself remained composed, despite the storm brewing around her. When Ethan informed her of the imminent confrontation, she said only, "Do what you know is right." There was no plea, no anger, just calm resolve. Her strength fortified Ethan more than he would admit. At noon, the board convened in a private conference room shielded from the media. As Ethan entered, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Gerald King sat at the far end of the long table, a faint smirk playing on his lips, flanked by allies eager to see Ethan fall. The chairman called the meeting to order. King wasted no time. "Before we proceed with standard business," he began smoothly, "I must raise a matter of concern. Our CEO's recent conduct, his emotional instability, questionable decisions regarding corporate risk and personal entanglements pose a danger to this company's future. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence." Ethan stood before the vote could be called. His voice was steady, the room falling silent as he spoke. "Before any vote proceeds, this board needs to see what I've uncovered. This is no longer about business disagreements. It is about the integrity of this institution. With that, he distributed the damning documents. The board members read in tense silence, transaction records, emails, off-the-books payments. Some faces paled, others glanced nervously at King. Ethan delivered the final blow, a sworn affidavit from a former King associate detailing the intimidation of Lucia's mother and the cover-up of past crimes. The room erupted. One board member demanded an immediate investigation. Another called for King's suspension. Gerald King's facade cracked. "This is a smear campaign," he barked, but the evidence was irrefutable. The chairman, visibly shaken, ordered a recess. Outside the conference room, Ethan paced while his attorneys negotiated next steps. His pulse pounded, but beneath it all was a strange clarity. For the first time in years, he was acting from principle, not profit. When the board reconvened, the tide had turned. King's allies were now scrambling to distance themselves. A motion to remove King from his positions passed with a resounding majority. The man who had once controlled Lancaster Holdings through fear and greed was finished. Yet as the board prepared to move on, Ethan delivered one final surprise. Effective. "Immediately," he announced, "I am stepping down as CEO. This company must rebuild without me." A stunned silence followed. Ethan met their gazes without regret. He had no desire to preside over a corrupted empire reborn. His role in its darkest chapters would not be whitewashed by recent victories. Word of the shake-up spread quickly through the corporate world. The press swarmed, but Ethan avoided statements. Instead, he returned to the Boston mansion one last time. There, in the quiet of his father's room, he found Lucia. William Lancaster's condition had deteriorated sharply. The end was near. For hours, Ethan and Lucia remained in the room together. No words were needed. As evening fell, William passed away, his hand held by the woman whose life he had once shattered. When the news broke, Ethan made no public appearance. The funeral was private, attended only by a few close family and staff. Yet amid the somber gathering, Lucia and her mother stood quietly at the back, their presence a silent testament to dignity and forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Ethan withdrew from public life. He declined interviews, refused offers to lead other firms, and ignored the whispers of opportunists eager to exploit his fall. Instead, he focused on settling personal debts. Without fanfare, he arranged full financial restitution to the Morales family and others wronged by Lancaster Holdings. The gestures were quiet, their meaning known only to a few. Meanwhile, Lucia resumed her studies. Ethan, aware of her progress through trusted channels, kept his distance. They had both earned the right to move forward unburdened. Yet fate had one more moment in store. Months later, in a small Boston cafe, their paths crossed again. Ethan, older now in spirit if not in appearance, entered seeking nothing more than solitude. There at a corner table sat Lucia, absorbed in a book. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. A simple nod passed between them, a gesture of respect, of understanding. It was enough. As Ethan left the cafe, he carried no illusions of redemption, no grand sense of closure. He knew only that some wounds could not be undone, but choices moving forward mattered more. And for the first time in his life, he walked into the future free of the shadows that had defined him. The aftermath of the boardroom battle spread across the financial press like wildfire. Headlines trumpeted the downfall of Gerald King, and the shocking resignation of Ethan Lancaster, the man once thought untouchable in the world of American industry. Reporters swarmed the gates of the Lancaster estate. Analysts speculated about the company's uncertain future, and rivals circled like vultures. Yet inside the mansion, Ethan remained insulated from the chaos, indifferent to the empire he had willingly left behind. His attention was fixed on the final hours of his father, who lay fading in a world far removed from corporate wars and boardroom intrigue. For once, Ethan saw William Lancaster not as a titan of industry, but as a frail man imprisoned by the consequences of his own ruthless ambition. During those long, quiet hours, Lucia remained a steady presence. She offered no lectures, sought no apologies. Her compassion spoke louder than any words. Ethan, observing her, wrestled with emotions he had buried for years. Guilt, yes, but also an emerging respect, not only for Lucia's strength, but for her choice to care for the man whose empire had nearly destroyed her family. In those moments, he began to grasp a truth long foreign to him. Integrity was not about grand gestures or public victories. It was about the small, unseen choices that defined a person's character. When William finally passed, the mansion fell into a deep silence. The funeral, by Ethan's design, was private and unadorned. No corporate figures, no press, just a handful of family, staff, and a few old friends who had remained loyal through the years. Among them stood Lucia and her mother, not out of obligation, but as a quiet act of closure. Ethan noticed their presence from afar, his nod of acknowledgement subtle, yet sincere. There was no attempt to approach them that day. Some gestures were best left simple. In the days following the funeral, Ethan faced the monumental task of dismantling the remnants of his old life. He declined all offers to return to the corporate world, invitations to speak, to write memoirs, to serve on prestigious boards. All were met with polite refusals. The world of power and influence no longer held any allure. Instead, Ethan turned inward. Without fanfare, he arranged the legal transfer of funds to the Morales family, ensuring full restitution for the injustices inflicted upon them. The transactions were anonymous, the paper trail discreet. Ethan sought no recognition, only a measure of justice. Meanwhile, Lucia quietly resumed her studies, balancing work with her pursuit of a long-deferred education. News of Ethan's actions reached her through trusted sources. She understood the significance of what he had done, yet she carried no illusions. Redemption was not about erasing the past, but about choosing a different path forward. Months passed in this new equilibrium. Ethan, free from the trappings of wealth and expectation, discovered a life governed not by boardroom schedules, but by personal reflection and simple routines. He read voraciously, traveled quietly, and began to reconnect with parts of himself long forgotten. Their next encounter was unexpected. On a brisk autumn morning, Ethan entered a modest Boston cafe, seeking refuge from the cold. There, seated alone by the window, was Lucia, absorbed in her books. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world fell away. No words were exchanged, none were needed. A simple nod passed between them, a gesture rich with unspoken understanding. Each had walked a long, difficult path. Each carried scars invisible to the world. Yet in that quiet moment, there was no bitterness, no unfinished business, only mutual respect. Ethan left the cafe with a profound sense of clarity. The man who had once measured worth by balance sheets and market share now valued something far rarer: authenticity. He understood that true change was not proclaimed, but lived. The choices he had made would not erase the past, but they would shape the future. For Lucia, the path forward remained focused on her education and her family. She had no interest in lingering near the shadows of the Lancaster legacy. Yet she carried with her the knowledge that her strength had altered the course of powerful men, not through confrontation, but through the quiet force of dignity and compassion. As winter settled over Boston, the story of the Lancaster Empire's fall began to fade from headlines. New scandals emerged. Fresh faces dominated the business pages, yet within certain circles, whispers remained of the CEO who had chosen principle over power, of the woman whose presence had forced a reckoning. Ethan embraced his new anonymity. He no longer sought control over vast empires. Instead, he pursued a quieter life, one guided by a deeper understanding of responsibility and consequence. The transformation was not dramatic or public. It unfolded in the choices Ethan now made daily, in how he treated others, in the humility with which he approached his remaining wealth, in the respect he showed to those whose voices were too often ignored. The lessons learned in the final days of his father's life, in the presence of a humble caregiver, had left a mark no amount of corporate triumph could match. And so, in the heart of a city that had once bowed to his name, Ethan Lancaster chose a different legacy, not one of domination but of conscience. It was a choice felt more than seen, a legacy written not in headlines but in the quiet, enduring impact of a man who had finally understood the true meaning of power. The winter that followed was Ethan Lancaster's first in decades, spent outside the rigid structure of corporate command. The demands that had once consumed every waking hour were gone. In their place was a silence that many would have found unbearable. Yet for Ethan, it was a chance to confront the person he had become and the choices that had defined him. Without board meetings or shareholder calls, he found himself walking the streets of Boston anonymously, observing the city from a perspective he had never allowed himself to see. The wealth and poverty that coexisted so visibly now struck him with an intensity he had long ignored. There were lessons in every encounter: humility where once there had been entitlement, empathy where once there had been calculation. Throughout this period, Ethan remained steadfast in protecting what little privacy he had left. Though many sought interviews or insight into his dramatic resignation, he kept his distance from the public stage. His former allies had largely abandoned him, seeing no further value in association. Yet Ethan welcomed the solitude. It allowed him to methodically complete the personal reparations he had promised himself he would undertake. Quietly, through intermediaries, he continued to identify individuals and families harmed by Lancaster Holdings' past dealings. Where possible, he directed restitution to them without attribution. He understood that no amount of money could truly atone for lives derailed by greed, but he also knew that choosing to act was the only way forward. Meanwhile, he followed Lucia's progress from afar. Reports from trusted sources indicated that she was excelling in her studies and that her mother's health had stabilized. Ethan resisted any temptation to reach out directly. Their last encounter at the cafe had closed the chapter between them with an unspoken understanding, one that he respected deeply. She had her life to rebuild, and he had no right to impose upon it. Still, knowing she was thriving provided a rare source of peace amid the wreckage of his former existence. As spring approached, Ethan began traveling, short trips to places he had once dismissed as unimportant. Coastal towns, mountain trails, small communities untouched by the corporate empires he had helped expand. Each journey offered new perspectives and a deeper appreciation for lives built on resilience and integrity. During one such trip, he spent an afternoon speaking with a retired shipbuilder whose stories of honest labor and community stirred something long dormant within him. These encounters reshaped his understanding of legacy, not as a monument to oneself, but as the quiet impact one left on others. Months turned into a year. By then, the scandal surrounding Lancaster Holdings had faded from the headlines, replaced by fresher corporate crises. Ethan's name no longer commanded the reverence or fear it once had. In truth, he welcomed this obscurity. It allowed him to live without the constant weight of expectation or scrutiny. Yet even in this new life, the shadows of the past occasionally resurfaced. In an old acquaintance's wary glance, in a news article referencing the company's ongoing reforms, in the occasional letter from a former employee expressing gratitude or regret. One evening, while sorting through personal files, Ethan came across a photograph long buried among corporate memorabilia. It showed William Lancaster in his prime, flanked by a young Ethan, both exuding the arrogance of men convinced of their rightful place atop the world. For a long time he stared at the image, wrestling with a cascade of emotions. Anger at the harm inflicted by that legacy, sorrow for what had been lost, and a fragile hope that perhaps in the choices made since, he had begun to forge something better. With deliberate hands, he placed the photo in a drawer, not erased, but no longer displayed. As the second winter approached, Ethan's life had settled into a new rhythm. The grand mansion in Boston remained empty. He chose instead a modest townhouse, its simplicity a constant reminder of the values he now strove to uphold. His days were spent reading, writing, and quietly supporting causes that aligned with the lessons he had learned. He accepted that redemption was not a destination, but an ongoing commitment, one lived through daily acts, not grand declarations. One crisp December afternoon, while visiting a local bookstore, Ethan once again crossed paths with Lucia. She entered with an air of quiet confidence, a stack of law books in her arms. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the world receded. They exchanged a brief smile, warm, genuine, unburdened by the past. Ethan felt no need to approach, no compulsion to explain. Their previous understanding held true. Respect was best maintained through restraint. Watching her move through the store, poised and purposeful, Ethan knew that her strength had shaped his own transformation more than any boardroom battle ever had. As he left the bookstore and stepped into the winter air, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. There had been loss and regret, yes, but also growth and an awakening to truths he had long denied. The empire he once ruled had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption, yet in its place he had found a path of greater meaning. A path forged not in pursuit of power, but in service to conscience. The world would move on as it always did. New magnates would rise, new scandals would capture public attention. Yet for Ethan Lancaster, the true victory lay not in headlines or fortunes, but in the quiet knowledge that when faced with the chance to choose integrity over expedience, he had done so. And in that choice, he had finally begun to understand the true nature of legacy, not one imposed upon others, but one reflected in the lives touched, the wrongs addressed, and the dignity restored. It was a lesson learned late, but learned well. And it was enough. Spring returned to Boston, its streets softened by light and the patient greening of the trees, and with it came the subtle confirmation that time moved on whether or not one was ready. For Ethan Lancaster, the passing seasons had become markers of a life rebuilt, not in grandeur or influence, but in small, deliberate choices. The townhouse where he now lived was modest by any measure, its rooms sparsely furnished yet well kept, the kind of place one chose for quiet rather than display. He had grown comfortable with the rhythms of a life unbound from corporate demands, and even more comfortable with the understanding that much of his former world no longer held a place for him. The news cycles had long shifted to newer dramas. Lancaster Holdings continued under new leadership, reshaping its image with promises of transparency and reform. Ethan neither sought updates nor offered advice. Some chapters were best left closed. His days often began with long walks through the city, the streets now unfamiliar in the way one's own reflection becomes after a long absence of honest scrutiny. He passed office towers where once his presence would have drawn deference, yet now he moved unnoticed, another face in the crowd. There was a peculiar freedom in this anonymity. He found it easier to observe without expectation, to appreciate without the filters imposed by wealth and power. Cafes where he would have once ordered in haste became places of reflection. Markets where price had once been irrelevant now revealed the quiet dignity of daily labor. In these spaces, the world seemed less like a game to be won and more like a fabric held together by unseen hands. In the solitude of his townhouse, Ethan had taken to reading not business journals, but philosophy, history, and the occasional novel, works that had once seemed indulgent in a life governed by profit margins. The words of others, their struggles and insights resonated more deeply now. He found himself returning often to the writings of those who understood that true leadership began not with command, but with self-awareness. These late lessons were absorbed without fanfare, folded quietly into a new understanding of who he had been and who he might yet become. Occasionally letters would arrive, some from those he had quietly aided, others from former associates seeking some form of reconnection. Most he left unanswered. The need to explain, to justify or reassert relevance had faded. He had come to accept that not every relationship could or should be salvaged. The measure of his actions would live in the spaces between public knowledge and private consequence. And that was enough. On certain afternoons, when the light fell just right through the townhouse windows, he would find himself seated at his desk, fingers resting on an old leather-bound notebook. It remained mostly empty, save for a few pages where thoughts not intended for public reading had been scrawled. The act of writing had become less about recording events and more about clarifying them for himself. One afternoon, in the early hush of summer, he ventured again to the small bookstore where he had once crossed paths with Lucia Morales. There was no expectation of seeing her again. The city moved too quickly, lives diverged too easily. Yet, as he browsed the shelves, absorbed in a collection of essays, a familiar voice carried softly through the space. Turning, he glimpsed her. Speaking with the owner, her expression animated, her eyes alight with the confidence of someone who had weathered storms and emerged unbowed. She carried no trace of the uncertainty he had first seen in the Lancaster mansion, nor of the burdened patience she had shown in his father's final days. This was a woman fully in command of her own path. Their eyes met briefly across the room. There was no grand recognition, no overt gesture of reunion. Instead, a faint, knowing smile passed between them, an acknowledgement of all that had been and all that had quietly changed. Ethan inclined his head in a small, respectful nod, and after a moment, she returned the gesture before turning back to her conversation. He did not approach, nor did she invite it. Some moments carried their own completeness. As he left the bookstore, the air seemed lighter, though nothing had been spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, Ethan resumed his simple routines, carrying with him the quiet resonance of that brief encounter. He thought of it often, not with longing or regret, but with a profound respect for the journey they had both endured, the choices he had made, the actions taken and not taken had shaped this new existence. He understood that while some debts could never be fully repaid, the manner in which one lived going forward held its own weight. The impact of those decisions would ripple outward in ways unseen, carried in the gestures, conversations, and unseen kindnesses that defined the quieter corners of a life. As another autumn approached, Ethan prepared to travel again, this time with no fixed destination. The act of moving through the world had become as much a practice of reflection as of discovery. Before departing, he returned once more to the drawer where he had placed the old photograph of his father and himself. This time, he did not linger. With a steady hand, he closed the drawer without removing its contents. Some images were best left where they belonged, not erased, but no longer granted dominion over the present. Boarding a train bound for the coast, Ethan found a seat by the window and settled in as the city receded. The countryside unfolded in passing hues of green and gold, the rhythm of the rails a steady counterpoint to the turning of his thoughts. He carried no expectation of resolution, no desire for accolades. What mattered was the path itself, the daily act of choosing conscience over convenience, of listening more than speaking, of seeing rather than assuming. These were lessons not proclaimed but practiced, their weight measured not in words, but in the spaces between them. As dusk fell and the train continued its course, Ethan watched the changing light with a quiet sense of acceptance. The man he had been was gone. The man he was becoming remained a work in progress, and perhaps that was as it should be. Some journeys were not about arrival, but about the continual act of moving forward, guided not by certainty, but by the fragile, essential pull of understanding.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.